Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar. Netacea Head of Vet Research Scott Pendlebury and myself, James Oakes, Senior Account Manager here at Netacea, are joined by 𝗬cie viņš, Partner at Lovelace Consultancy. As a quick round of introduction, 𝗬cie has worked against the betting industry for many years. He specialised in exploiting websites, bonus engine logics and game mechanics using many identities in a way that's currently legal to sustainable six-figure annual income. 𝗬cie has ended up consulting for a company that he had previously taken a significant amount of money from, which led 𝗬cie to turning his back on his old life and going on to work with 16 operators in the last 9 months, as well as several platform and slot providers. To kick things off, what I'm going to do is just give a general overview and an introduction to bots before we get into the meat of the webinar. So, about bots. So, what is a bot? A bot is any online interaction or request that was not the action of a human. So it's an automated process. Nowadays, you may not be surprised to hear that more than 50% of global online traffic is actually bots. And there's good and bad. Now, there's a fairly close split between those good and those bad, and being in a unique position, let's see, we get to see quite a lot of the bad bot traffic. So, because of our experience in various industries, we see a lot of good and bad bots as mentioned. Some of these are universal across all sectors. But one of the unique things that I've experienced working with operators in the betting and gaming industry is that not all bots are bad. There's very much a focus that there has to be visibility over them. There has to be control over them. But we need to recognize and understand that customers use bots, your VIPs use bots, and other partners as well. And there are some out there that are very malicious and fraudulent in their activity, but there are also many that's actually beneficial for the business. Now, what we're going to do is talk a little bit more about the types of bots and their sophistication, and we're going to keep focus on some of those bad bots. So bad bots, it's different from hacking, okay? Very early stage bots, we're looking at things like SQL injection and cross-site scripts that your WAFs are looking at now. Whereas bots these days they're not looking to exploit code or vulnerabilities. They're just looking to exploit business logic weaknesses in your site. And these aren't always easy to identify because a lot of the times business logic is designed in mind for the customer and the consumer in terms of the UX. But one of the things that isn't discussed much is we always talk about sophistication of bots, but just how sophisticated are they now compared to where they were? Globally, we are on our fourth iteration of our fourth gen bots at the top of the sophistication level. And just as a quick breakdown, I'm just going to go through the 4 generations just so you have an idea as to what they bring to the table. So first generation bots are single task bots. These are very early days. It was all about form fills, social likes. They can't solve captures. Okay, so not the smartest to get around very basic mitigation techniques. Second generation, a little bit more complex, now are able to operate in a headless browser mode. So these bots can execute JavaScript. They can also maintain cookies. Nowadays, we do see these more often not used in DDoS-based attacks. But really, it is third and fourth generation where we want to have more conversations around. These are the ones that are difficult to identify and are very impactful to businesses. So third generation bots, they are capable of operating in full browser mode. They can even perform the same functions as humans, so they can make those interactions. Where they trip up is that they're not as random as humans. Okay, so you can look at these from like mouse movements and interaction. That sometimes there are telltale signs. But that is where fourth gen, which is what now we are seeing predominantly across the state, is now what's happening with fourth generation bots. They are mimicking human behavior, they're mimicking those interactions, and they're mimicking movements as well. So it's not, there aren't any very easy triggers to identify these types of bots. So what are bots doing, and why is that important to us in the betting and gaming industry? Well, a lot of press around bots is focused on things like credential stuffing, account takeovers, and these attacks are very high priority. You know, they shouldn't be ignored. Customer accounts on sportsbook and casino sites are still high priority targets given, you know, what's involved in them. But the root cause of a lot of problems we see and we discuss with operators, the root cause actually comes from scraping. Now, scraping is often overlooked as it's unsophisticated, and in truth, it can be difficult to measure the impact, should we say, from scraping. So what we've been doing here at Netacea is looking a lot more into the sophistication, methods and things that are used. And Scott, I believe you've been doing a lot of research recently into how sophisticated these attacks have now become.
Yeah, thanks for that, James. Yeah, so what I'm going to essentially do is just have a look at changes that we've observed to the ecosystem that essentially supports malicious automation, such as, you know, web scraping and credential stuffing and those kinds of things that you just mentioned. So if we start off here, we've got a couple of kind of open proxy lists. So if you think about how distribution of an attack might have taken place originally, still just a little bit in this way as well at the kind of lower levels of sophistication. So you've got a couple of open proxy lists here, but the problem with these lists is that they provide proxies where the IPs have, you know, their poor reputation. They're easy to identify that they're being used, so they're easy to block as well because they're on a lot of blacklists. They come from big data centers, so they're easily recognizable and easy to shut down. And it could be that they're also coming from compromised devices, so those proxies don't stay up for very long as well. So what we're seeing the use of now, and what's interesting as well, is the use of residential proxy networks. Is we're seeing that this traditionally was used at the more kind of sophisticated end of attacks, but it's like many things, like with technology and many things in general, it doesn't take long for these techniques to kind of trickle down and the use of these to get known about and wide and mainstream adoption take place. So a residential proxy network is essentially, it allows the proxying of network traffic rather than proxying through, say, for example, data centers. It allows traffic to be proxied through home internet normal service providers that, you know, consumers would use. And the benefit that these provide to attackers is that they're able to blend in with other consumer traffic that you might see hitting your site and using it as it should be. What's also a benefit of these over, say, for example, open proxy lists and VPNs is that they're, again, much harder to recognize because it's not using that same technology. So when we look at these services, these are two big players. They're big professional businesses. They're not doing anything illegal either. One of the use cases that they say they can be used for is for web scraping. They're kind of proud that they're able to provide access for people to use them for web scraping. So if we just have a look now, just a couple of examples again of those two services, just a little bit interesting to look at how they actually work. So Monkey Socks, there on the left, the way they work is they'll say to an app developer, rather than have your app display adverts in the middle of playing a game or something, when the phone is latent, you integrate our code into your app. When the phone's not being used, it can be used to proxy our customer traffic through the network and through that home network. As against Luminati, they've sort of solved the problem in a different way. They offer a free VPN to download on the App Store, and again, when that phone isn't being used and when it's at rest, Luminati proxy traffic can then go through that. So you can imagine that's, you know, how difficult that is to recognize who is behind the actual traffic when it's the same device that traffic is actually coming from. So another development that we've been recognizing that attackers making use of is if we think now, if we move away from looking at the network and controls around use of the network, and we look at the client instead. So for a number of years now, anti-fraud technology has existed to essentially ask the question of a client, what does it say about itself? As James mentioned before, can the client execute JavaScript? What fonts and plugins are installed? What time zones it say it belongs to? Does the IP location match the browser language? And those kinds of logical questions about those browsers. And essentially these browsers, these anti-fingerprint browsers, were developed as a response to recognition that those kinds of checks are taking place. So what they will do instead is they will allow a user to spoof those signals. For example, you might use the browser anti-detect. You might say that you've got a fingerprint of a Safari browser running on iOS, when really it's actually that browser running on Windows 7, for example. And I think what's interesting about these is they actually posit themselves as advocates of privacy, and that's where they're focusing. That's why they developed this technology. But I think if you start to lose a little bit of credibility when you name your anti-fingerprint browser Fraud Fox, it kind of gives away the true intent and use of that tool. Instead, it is actually used to defeat those anti-fraud technologies, and it's really not much about privacy. So then moving that on to the next stage, in the modern day, everything is as a service, and it's the same with anti-fingerprint browsers. So there's a service here which is called Multi-Login, and they have a couple of browsers which are anti-fingerprint browsers, similar to the ones we've just looked at. And what they allow you to do is automate the use of anti-fingerprint browsers en masse. And again, they have a number of use cases which they say, this is why we exist. And one of those is, again, it's web scraping to defeat those controls that have been put in place, for client detection, and essentially circumvent those controls and get the data you actually want to get. So I think what's interesting about that use case, and the use case again that we've seen echo before with the use of Luminati for web scraping, is there's nothing actually illegal about doing that. There's nothing illegal about spoofing fingerprints of a browser, for example. There's nothing actually illegal about web scraping, but it doesn't provide solace to a business owner who's their data is kind of what's prized them, and they don't want other competitors, say for example, getting hold of that. And I think with the awareness that, for example, services like this have, both of the legality of actually what it is that they're doing, for example, scraping sites, and the awareness of the technology that exists to facilitate that as well, they're able to quite happily operate, knowing that they can provide a service to others, and there's nothing that's going to kind of stop in the way. The only controls that are going to stop in the way are going to be technical controls. So yeah, that was just a little kind of short overview of some of the change that we're seeing in the ecosystem that supports malicious automation. I'm just going to hand over now to Osric, who's got some more insight into specific and use of these kind of automated tooling, but actually focus those on the betting and gaming industry.
Thank you. Yes, so when it comes to bonus abuse, bots are a very useful way of working more efficiently, scaling an operation and optimizing the amount of value that can actually be exploited. So I'm going to cover just a few of these that are popular with bonus abusers and also widely available. So I'll start with auto clickers. So there are a few different types of casino abuse, but the main one is advantage play. An advantage play is when the player, on average, profits from the casino offer by following the terms and conditions, sort of playing as intended. Difference is that the player will likely only ever play positive value offers or will never return again after exploiting the value of the welcome offer. Most of this abuse comes from multi-accounting operations, where one person is controlling tens, hundreds or thousands of identities and accounts. This gives them the opportunity to essentially repeat that process and increase the amount that they can make. In order to optimize their profits, they will often be working on many accounts at any one given time by using several devices, virtual machines, or remote access to several devices. As spinning slots is quite a slow and manual process, auto clickers are able to automate this process while also speeding it up and more accurately identifying when to stop spinning if the wagering has been complete. Another commonly used bot is registration bots. This often involves more serious identity theft. I'll give an example of a use case. Some sites offer no deposit welcome offers. Generally, the chance of winning from offers like this is very low due to high turnover requirements and low value. Some fraudsters will scrape thousands of names and address from public records such as company's house and automate registration using these details. Registration bots and auto clickers can be downloaded really easily and they're free. For all things sport abuse, so things like free bet abuse, arbitrage betting, dutching and odds trading, there's a reliance on API feeds of odds, some of which collect the odds of over 200 sites in real time. And these bots often are able to interact with the front end of bookies and place the desired bet in the bet slip for the bonus abuser. They are also integrated with many exchanges that automate the calculations and placement of the lay bet, even without leaving the bot's interface. Access to one of these is roughly £15 a month and is a tool that almost every bonus abuser has access to and uses. Similar to the odds checker, there are bots that are able to identify arbitrage bets through odds APIs, communicating with bookmakers' front ends and placing the bet with no human interaction. A prime example of this is the 𝗬cie_𝗁𝗏 bot. It places a high volume of low value bets in the 𝗬cie market that have a rating of over 100%. It integrates with 6 bookmakers' front ends and places bets 24 hours a day, essentially printing money while you sleep.
Thank you for that, Osric. Yeah, I think you touched on a fair few points there in terms of how bots are impacting trading teams and fraud teams. And you mentioned there before in terms of identity theft. I think it's not just in the betting and gaming industry. It's every vertical experiences this, but all aspects of businesses are impacted by bots. And I'd just like to bring just a quick attention to KYC and AML on this one. So when we're talking about things like identity theft, there's a lot of regulation that goes into knowing your customer. The challenge, though, is that if a breach happens on a third-party website, a company completely outside you as an operator, bots use that stolen identity and information as part of their account creations. So it does become extremely difficult to actually know your customer, and even if your processes are really tight, you can't always be absolutely sure because of breaches that are happening on third-party companies. I think what we're getting into a lot more discussions with recently is around AML in terms of how bots are leveraging certain environments for things like this. When we think about a bot at its purest form, it's there to execute actions quickly, disappear. These third and fourth generation bots are only making a couple of requests and then leaving your infrastructure. and they're all trying to do it under the radar. I mean, it's making environments like poker rooms and esports and things like that just absolute prime targets for this type of activity. And I think that that is important as well, of understanding, you know, the impact of bots in betting. So from a high level, we're talking about odds scraping, and it is extremely cheap to deploy a scraping attack. As Scott mentioned then, you know, the tactics nowadays, the methods are becoming just as sophisticated as the bots themselves, and they're getting a lot harder to actually detect. There are other problems as well in terms of what scraping will do when we're talking away from the impact against fraud, but in terms of infrastructure, you know, bots aren't bothered about cache contents and things like that. They put huge emphasis and huge pressure on your infrastructure, and ultimately, as a business, you're paying to serve, you know, your data to these bots. Now, as I said, it can be often ignored, bots and scraping in particular. But what scraping actually does and how it leads to some of these forms of abuse is it helps to promote those types of abuses, such as some of the things that we've mentioned on today's webinar. But in terms of one particular is arbitrage betting, in terms of it will scrape the data and promote these events, and aggregators will use it to leverage on that. But Osric, I think you've got a little bit more insight into arbitrage betting than I have.
Yeah. So I'll just simplify it for the listeners. So arbitrage betting is when bets are placed on all possible outcomes of an event at odds that basically guarantee a profit regardless of the outcome. This can be done as a two-way bet with an exchange, which we typically call backing and laying, or it can be Dutched across multiple bookies. Dutching is the process of covering every outcome of an event that has sort of 3 or more outcomes. Dutching is particularly popular on high-profile horse races, where bookmakers are offering generous extra places on each-way markets. So the way this works is someone would cover every single horse and guarantee a profit, essentially. Arbitrage betting basically exploits inaccurate odds, usually at the cost of the operator.
Absolutely, and the scraping of that data just helps collate those opportunities for exploitation. And I think it's interesting that you mentioned now, Rick, about horse racing being used as that's where we've seen a lot of this abuse take action, and I think it's important just to understand what that kind of looks like in a real world scenario. So when we're looking at this from a real world scenario basis here, one of the first, shall we say, ways in which Netacea was exposed to this was we were working and still are working with one of the top 10 operators in the UK, and we started engaging with them before the Grand National, you know, arguably the biggest horse racing event on the calendar, and there was a concern about bots and scraping and what it was actually doing to the business. So what were scraping bots doing? So as Osric mentioned, they were collecting data, they were aggregating all the odds from the horses and trying to exploit those imbalances in the odds. Now, leading up to the national, we saw a significant rise in scraping, some of which were sticking out like sore thumbs. Some were utilizing those techniques and those distribution methods as Scott mentioned before, and it was interesting to see, you know, what the bots were looking for, how they were interacting, and ultimately the impact onto the operator. But what we were able to do is work with that operator, and when we reduced the amount of bots that were on there, we were able to ultimately increase the capacity of the sports book at the time. it protects the availability during such a prestigious event. Now, when we looked into it, we had seen that there were aggregators that were orchestrating some of these bots, and they were, as we discussed, they were leveraging that data and promoting, our betting across the horse race, schedule. And we were seeing acts such as even match betting and creation of fake accounts. From a technology standpoint, it's sometimes difficult for us to fully appreciate the true impact of this. We attributed this as a potential £12 million problem for the operator, but this would be an interesting webinar if we all agreed on things. And I think when I had this discussion with 𝗬liche a few weeks back, he was first one to jump on it and have a bit of dispute about this number. So do you want to just weigh in on why we're still disagreeing on this one then, 𝗬liche?
Yeah, so that figure to me just seems too conservative. So if you look at it from the bonus abuse perspective, you can kind of calculate the value by looking at the amount of forum members. So there's 300,000 bonus abusers registered to kind of paid up forums in the UK. Pretty much all of these members are using bots in one way or another. So most commonly the kind of odds matching software that's also able to navigate the bet slips and place bets. So that 12 million figure would assume that each of those people is only taking £40, which just to put that into perspective, some of these forums give you free guides to earn more than £40 as a proof of concept before you even join. So to me, it seems way out. I would put that figure kind of more in the hundreds of millions.
No, fair enough. I like the fact there was a little bit of laughter underneath it as we took over on that one. But no, it's difficult. It's difficult sometimes from a technology perspective, understanding the real impact. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, obviously with your experience and consultancy, you're able to measure the impact of these actions a lot better than we can. I think that's fair to say. So in terms of summarizing what we've discussed on today's webinar, bots are discussed regularly. There are good, there are bad, and there are ones that we just need visibility on and want to decide whether or not we want to authorize them or not. But bots are a threat. We're seeing it's easier to deploy, it's cheaper, it's a lot easier to deploy these sophisticated distribution methods, and ultimately people are leveraging from operators intellectual property and data in ways that we either don't want them to, or we at least want to put a sense of control on. But if there's any takeaway that you from this webinar, we're just encouraged that you understand your bot traffic. A WAF, as an example, as a solution, is a great starting point to stop bots. But WAFs are not able to detect these third generation and fourth generation bots. It's absolutely vital that you have a full understanding. Many of you will have some bot activity, but whether or not there is an ROI in there for you to actually resolve that now is down to you. But all we ask is you just get some visibility onto it, and ultimately that will help you in choosing what's the right bot strategy for yourself. So getting that visibility into your bot situation and taking the first step is to get an audit. Now, you need to be aware of bot traffic coming in across both websites and mobile apps that you have, but as well as 𝗬liche mentioned there, a lot of these bots are leveraging the API infrastructure as well. So having visibility across all those channels is ultimately going to give you the best information to make the most informed decision about what's best for your business. And ultimately, it's understanding the intent of the traffic. You know, if you have a lot of bot traffic, but they are actually beneficial to the business, we need to understand that before taking any sort of action against them. Best thing to do would be to email the hello@Netacea email address on here. If you would like, more than happy to make introductions to Lovelace Consultancy, or please feel free to reach out to them directly if you feel that they'd be in a better position to help. Other than that, thank you very much for attending today. I hope you found it helpful and insightful, and we'll speak soon. Bye.
Thanks for that, James, and to all of our panelists, that insightful look into bots in betting today. You can start your journey towards an effective bot management strategy in a few simple steps, so please do feel free to contact the Netacea team. And now let's move on to the Q&A. So we've had several questions put to us. I'm going to start with one for 𝗖𝗹. What do you think the future of bots in betting holds? And can you give us any predictions about how they might evolve?
I'm seeing that in some circumstances, advantage players are using more sophisticated technology than the operators. This is particularly the case in sport betting, where a lot of the tech is spilled over from stock market trading. Machine learning is being applied to arbitrage betting and value betting to reverse engineer the operator's risk detection models and increase the longevity of betting accounts. This is essentially a fully automated process. I think we're going to see a lot more utilization of machine learning going forward for both the industry and against the industry.
Thanks for that, 𝗖𝗹. So can you explain a little bit about how machine learning is being used within the bot betting industry at the moment? Do you have any examples?
Yeah, so in terms of generating odds, but also in terms of identifying risk. So both in fraud and on kind of betting patterns. So a lot of the trading now is kind of identified automatically, looking at the different kind of risk thresholds that the operator is willing to take.
And I guess over to Scott from here. Can you explain how it's used from the other side in terms of defending businesses against those bots as they utilize machine learning?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're at a point now with cybersecurity industry in general, and how many events are coming through and how many different types of events are coming through, that really, you know, the optimal sort of route to dealing with a bot that's using, or that is at least augmented with AI or machine learning in some way, is to kind of use machine learning against it. You know, there's so many. If you think of the average, you know, security operations center, the average analyst who's looking at, they're kind of inundated with alerts of various different things that are happening, regardless of whether it's something on the website or something that's happening internally. So I think this, you know, we are at a turning point now where attackers are starting to augment AI and machine learning in what they're doing, and really it's at a point where that's what defenders need to do as well. You know, you need to kind of fight fire with fire, so to speak.
Can you provide any examples as to what that means, or what businesses should be looking out for from a bot management strategy, from their solution?
Yes, I mean, the perfect example, really, well, I say perfect, you know, there's no kind of silver bullet to any solution, but if I'm to give you an example of the way that we look at things, for example, is we look at the behavior and the intent of a particular piece of activity. You know, some of this bot activity that we're seeing, it was sophisticated beforehand, but to enhance it and augment that sophistication with AI, the kind of activity that we're seeing happen, it would just go under the radar of anybody that's just looking at that normal kind of traffic. So one example of that would be, we see a lot of low and slow activity, so to speak. So you'll see bots, they'll target a website, and they'll make sure they kind of keep it under the radar of typical kind of user activity on a site, to make sure that they're not being picked up in what would be, otherwise picked up in kind of big spikes in traffic hitting sites.
Great, thank you for that, Scott. That really helped explain on both parts from Maybrook and Scott how machine learning is being used by bots in betting. And our next question is for James. So you speak to a lot of customers at the point of investment in bot management. What do you find typically drives them towards this decision?
Yeah, it's a good question there, Danny. I think there's typically two engagement types we experience from Netacea's side. The first type is where operators will come to us, and various other parts of the industry will come to us knowing that they have a problem. Usually this comes after a major event like an account takeover attack or credential stuffing attack, or they're utilizing some internal triggers, and perhaps some of those bots, as Scott just mentioned, have been identified. They haven't kept hidden, but it's raised the question that we do have a problem and we do need to address it. At that point, the conversation is very much focused around the return of investment. What are we looking to measure, and how quickly can we deliver that ROI? But those types of engagements, in truth, are few and far between. The majority of businesses we'll engage with typically have two questions to answer. First one is, do I have a bot problem? 9 times out of 10 they do. But where the second question that comes from that, where it's really about, is it worthwhile the investment, is how big the problem is. In the betting industry, not all bots are bad. We've discussed that through this webinar. So it might be there's a bot problem, and just having some sense of control might actually offer more of an ROI on that. But it's understanding the impact, it's understanding where it's impacting in the business, and that can be an exercise in itself, because as we've discussed earlier, bots isn't just a topic that security needs to focus on. It impacts marketing teams, it impacts customer experience, trading teams, the fraud teams. It is a business-wide impact.
So I suppose in lieu of that, and the number of departments that it affects in a business, it must be quite difficult to have the ROI discussion, because it's going to differ per department. So how would you generally approach that subject?
Yeah, absolutely. So approaching that is, the first thing is we need to identify where a quick win comes from. Okay, if we were talking from a security perspective, and let's say we were dealing with a company that has regular account takeover, fake account creation, and credential stuffing attacks, a good unit of measurement might be from what's the customer password reset process. How long does that take? It might be a case of investigative time, because there's always what's the time to identification. Most people internally, most professionals internally will know, right, I can spot something in relative real time. But then the difficulty for a lot of professionals I speak to is actually the investigative part. It's trying to make sense of all those, all that data. And as Scott said earlier, a SOC analyst, they're not just looking at this, they're looking at everything across the business. So it's identifying those quick wins for one. But for two, it's opening up the conversation. It's not just something that security needs to speak to us about. More times than not, multiple groups of stakeholders will be brought into conversation. They might not be with the project, follow the project closely end to end, but having an initial conversation with them, understanding what they're how bots are impacting them, where improvements could be made, and just using some very high level ROI calculations is usually a very good starting point for a business case. But ultimately, once we've got that quick win and you're developing that relationship with the customer, you just build more upon that ROI as you get to understand, how the business operates and what the traffic is doing and what the bots are doing on their infrastructure.
Thanks, James. That really helped. Okay, and our last question is for Scott. So we're going back into more technical territory here. What are the warning signs that a betting organisation should look out for when a residential proxy network is being used to target their site?
So I guess really there aren't many warning signs because they're intentionally difficult to detect their use. So oftentimes they'll be used in, again, it's like a highly distributed manner. You'll see attack source from kind of all different geographical locations around the world. But I think, again, that's a couple of things to say on that is, the first is that many companies, they won't want to block connections based on geographics, because I think for big business as well, it's not often the case that they're going to kind of block entire regions from being used. One of the interesting things that we saw recently, so during the coronavirus outbreak, attackers are quite wily, so they're going to be looking at how, or thinking at least about how traffic might hit a site ordinarily. So one of the things that we saw during this outbreak for a lot of our UK businesses is that we could recognise that residential proxies were being used to continue to bot sites during this period, but rather than come from different places around the globe, rather than distribute that globally, again, what they would do is instead they would configure their proxy service to only come from UK ISPs. So not only have you got attacks that are hiding within ordinary residential traffic anyway, you've got traffic that's hiding in the correct geolocation as well of that, so it makes it increasingly difficult to detect. So again, that kind of goes back again to what was saying before, is if you're going to make detections based on conditions such as geographics, or whether something's a data center or it's just a home ISP or anything like that, you're going to get caught out when the attacker kind of changes what they're doing. So it goes back again to where we're saying we're only ever going to look at intent and behavior, because regardless of where it's coming from, or whether it's coming from a home or whether it's coming from a data center or whatever, if you're only looking at the behavior, or if you look at the behavior and other things, that behavior still needs to be, it's still going to be malicious, and it's still going to separate out from normal and genuine use of a website.
And is there any particular, I guess, attack vector that is targeted by residential proxy network attacks?
So I think for that one, it was residential proxies, and the use of them is becoming a lot more mainstream. So it would have been, maybe there was some more bespoke use of a more sophisticated use of residential proxies for botting certain things in the past. But I think because they're now becoming more known about, and because people and attackers are becoming a lot more aware that just using things like open proxy lists and so on is going to get you shut down pretty quickly, whatever you're doing. I don't think you could pin down any specific type of attack or any vector to just the use of residential proxies. I think you're going to start to see general, mainstream and typical bot activity, whatever it's doing, come from residential proxies, especially as well, since there are more residential proxy services coming online, and they're also becoming more accessible in terms of how much it actually costs to use. So that price is being driven down as a race to the bottom with those different providers to get that business.
That's really interesting, and it was particularly interesting earlier to see the type of marketplaces and how accessible they are, and as you said, notably how professional these services are. So thank you for that, Scott, for providing a bit more explanation. Thank you to all of our panelists today for their contributions to the webinar and throughout the Q&A. If you'd like to get in touch with any further questions to either Osric, Scott or James, please do send them to hello@netacea.com, where you'll also be able to inquire about a bot audit. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you in some of our upcoming webinars.